there's just this really like brewing tension in Russia that none of these analysts either can talk about, are willing to talk about, and it's just been really suffocating for me because I do have a personal experience with actual Russians that are far more, I would say, they're not anti-Russia. They love their country, but they're also not happy.
When a country like Russia is so clearly allied and cooperating with Israel, and it has such a huge Zionist Shabbat Lubavitch presence in its country that has influence within the political and economic circles to a huge extent, they are not going to, let's say, defend Iran against Israel.
So is Putin, by a segment of Russia, is Putin seen as a bit of a softy then?
Yeah.
He's a bit of a softy to the West and to Israel?
Oh, 100%. That's been the latest discussion.
Gaza is being handed over to the Epstein class. It's basically a community, the majority of whom are under the age of 18, is being handed over to child abusers and torturers, rapists, right? And they can't even put their hand up at the UN.
Even in Europe, all these people that celebrated Ukrainian resistance. We're talking about Nazis. And they could still identify more with Ukrainians than with what the Palestinian resistance is doing, or Iran. And there's just such a, like I said, there is this deep psychological effect of racialization that we are often very unaware of. All right, good day everyone. We are here again with sisters of the show, Vanessa, Beeley and Fiorella, Isabel. Two of my favorite geopolitical analysts. I recently saw you two do a show. And I was like, okay, I need to have you two together on again to talk about this. Because you talked about Russia, and that was a very, very good conversation. I can advise everybody who's watching to check that out. And that was coming from a standpoint that is very different than what we are used to in the anti-imperialist sphere. In the anti-imperialist sphere, you both also know there is this kind of taboo to be more nuanced or critical about certain countries, such as, of course, China, Russia. I don't know actually if there are any more, especially those two are very, very sensitive. And you live in Russia, of course, Fiorella, so you really have experience from the inside. Vanessa, you live in West Asia. You have experienced on the ground of what the Russians were doing, for example, in Syria and in Lebanon. Also very intimate understanding of what is going on. Now, I follow a lot of people in the anti-imperialist sphere. I think there is a lot of very interesting people, very talented people. But there's something I just really, really start to long for more nuanced discussions, for example, when it comes to Russia. I just hardly see anything where people dare to go a bit into the question, what's going on here? Why is Russia doing this, or why is Russia doing that? Now, I just saw a very interesting interview with Radhika Desai of a Russian, I think he is a professor in Russia, very well known, according to her, one of the most well-known economists or analysts, I don't know exactly, in Russia. Very interesting man to listen to. Also, of course, not anti-Russian at all. So it's not that his nuanced perspective meant he dislikes Russia. Actually, it's the opposite. But he also said some very interesting things. For example, he said that the war in Iran is extremely good for Russia, according to him. It's very good for its economy. It's booming. So Russia is in a very good position, according to him. He also said another very interesting thing. That's also something we never hear. He is very unhappy, he says, with the Russian central bank. According to him, the Russian central bank is very much in cahoots with the IMF, and that is a kind of that Western capitalist influence on Russia. So we already have within Russia, you could say, a schism. The fact that we never talk about these kind of schisms is, of course, already says that we're looking at many of the things geopolitically in a very black and white way. And I think that is a problem because some people are saying things that I find very hard to believe and difficult to swallow. To give you an example, and I must say I'm not a big fan of that person at all. There was this man called Colonel McGregor, and he's also on many of these anti-imperialist shows. He often talks about how immigrants hate Christianity in Europe, and he talks about how white men are being chased in the United States and having it very difficult over there. So that he has certain opinions that are not my opinions. But he also said, for example, a very interesting thing. He said that if Israel is attempting to try and use nukes, Russia won't stand for it. And Russia will respond with nukes, he said. Sorry, I should not laugh. But this is also sad. I'm laughing out of sadness. Sorry. But before I make my introduction, too long, can you guys give us a bit of an idea what is going on? To what extent can we say, okay, the Russians are helping Iran or not? What is the kind of, I want to start with you, Fiorella. What is the kind of sense you get in Russia? How are people perceiving the Iran war? And to what extent do you think Russia is involved or actually not involved?
Well, so there's two mechanisms going on here, and I think people just don't differentiate between the two, especially Western analysts. And there are Western analysts that have been to Russia, but they are given a certain type of treatment that is conductive for their own perspective to reflect a certain narrative, right? So if you're going to be taken into Russia and given a red carpet and only talk to the top politicians and the top, political elite of the country, you're going to get one perspective. But if you live in Russia and the entirety of the sentiment varies, not just within the people, of course, but also within sectors of the Russian Federation, from the military to the Kremlin to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the congressional sector in Russia, which I think also definitely varies. And that's what we call the Duma over there. And you then have to start gaining a more rounded perspective when that happens, right? And so when a lot of these people that talk, whether it's Douglas McGregor or Ritter, Scott Ritter, or other people, they tend to have a perspective based on the people they've met. Now, having lived there, known like the local perspective, I can tell you that the perspective of Russians from about the war in Ukraine, the special military operation, has shifted from more positive to negative because it's been 4 years, and it's lasted now longer than the Great Patriotic War, which is World War II. And they're seeing the Russians get continuously bombed and destroyed, whether it's their energy infrastructure or something related to one of their nuclear plants, as we've just recently seen, by the United States, Israel, or Ukraine, and they're seeing Russia not respond. That's caused a certain lack of confidence coming from some of the population that was patriotic, that is pro Putin, that is supportive of the SMO, that has been supportive. So you have seen a shift in sentiment from those people saying, "What are you going to do? I thought these were red lines that you had stated, that this is something that you said could never happen, and now they're crossing every red line and you're not responding. And that's also reflective of some in the military who do not like how Kirill Dmitriev has been directly negotiating with Jared Kushner, with Stephen Witkoff, and the Trump administration, who they seem as unreliable, untrustworthy, and are suggesting, this is going to be another Minsk. You can't really do negotiations with these people. These people don't respect negotiations. Have you not learned that? And then you have the likes of Sergei Lavrov, who has been far more vocal than, say, Putin and his spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, who have sort of just said the underlying thing. But overall, the Russian government as a whole condemns the attacks that Israel and the United States have done, but they don't do anything beyond the strongly worded condemnation. And this is now being reiterated and vocally affirmed by other people living in Russia. Some of the points that you mentioned are true. And when you look even at the regular population, apart from that fatigue, you have a very, very strong anti-Israel sentiment. That if you go into any sort of Russian forum, any sort of Russian social media, you're going to see that perspective come out, as wondering why the Russian Federation doesn't act against Israel. And there's more videos of Putin coming up from the past saying, there's 1 point something million Russians, almost 2 million Russians living in Israel. Israel is practically a Russian speaking country. And there is this sentiment from Russians who have a passport, and I know this very well. They are limited for their travel. They're being, attacked in certain immigration centers in the sense that they can't travel, or they have to have very special documentation, visas, and all of that. If you are a Russian Israeli, you have the magic card to go anywhere you want. And many of these also have US or EU passports. And there is a certain conversation that is like kind of critical of that, because a lot of these Russians abroad in Israel are also anti-Putin, and they're also anti the current Russian government. So why are they given such a high level of consideration? Now you add the other layer, which is the inflation that has gone up. Yes, you're right. Russia is benefiting greatly from the war in terms of the defense sector of Russia, in terms of the people who have the money, the elite sector, which is very much existent. No matter how many people say that Putin got rid of every single oligarch, Putin got rid of a lot of them, and he is also friendly with some of them. And a lot of these oligarchs are tied to Zionist money. And so you have this sector there that is making a lot of money, and you have the political class that is making money from this war in Iran, and that is 100% true. We have seen more Russian billionaires and millionaires increase in numbers in the last few years. You don't explain that in any other way. But the reality is the people of Russia are experiencing high inflation, high interest rates in buying home, high cost of rent. The cost of living overall has increased since my time there in 2022. And you're seeing in that span of time, people start complaining about all of the economic domestic issues, which we never focus on because we're always focused on foreign policy. And, I, as an American in the United States, we have a lot of issues there. So I'm not going to go and signal all the problems Russia has, but I will say as a viewer and a spectator and somebody that's lived there, then those exist obviously everywhere in the world, but those exist there too. Some people paint it like Russia is utopia. Well, no, it's not exactly that either. And then add to it what's most recently happened is this layer of surveillance where, yeah, Russia has been controlled from the SMO, protesting, that sort of thing has been very much heavily criticized because of Navalny and the attempts for regime change. They didn't want another Maidan that happened in Ukraine. They've been very scared of something like that happen, but now it's kind of taken this whole area where Russians themselves are criticizing it because they're censoring Telegram, WhatsApp. They're trying to block people from making phone calls via those apps. They're trying to get people to use Max, which is the state-run like version of Telegram. But if you download all of that, they have access to all of the websites you use, all of the people you interact with on the internet. And a lot of people are really speaking out against this, saying that this is not fair. And there have been protests organized, but the protests are being criminalized. And so there's just this really like brewing tension in Russia that none of these analysts either can talk about, are willing to talk about. And it's just been really suffocating for me because I do have a personal experience with actual Russians that are far more, I would say, they're not anti-Russia. They love their country, but they're also not happy with the current situation. And that is a more real rounded perspective than the one, I'm sorry, coming from people either paid to say what they're saying or benefiting in one way or another, or just having these rose-colored lenses like we've talked about. So just as like a brief overall, that's kind of how I'm seeing it. And on the Iran issue, quickly as I finish, the Russians have literally all said, and they don't tend to lie about this stuff. When they don't want to say something, they don't say it. They just omit it or there's silence. That is like a cultural thing people need to understand. There's not a full on, denial. They just don't say something. They have said vocally, we are not providing intelligence to Iran. And they don't want to position themselves as being on a military aspect beyond the strategic partnership that we've discussed here before, because there's no defense pact with Iran. And the idea of Russia supplying drones, well, Iran's drones are being used right now by Russia against Ukraine. But nobody talks about that. It's always this idea that Iran needs Russia and China. And that is another aspect that I think we can dive to.
Yeah, very well said. That actually reminds me of something. I don't know if any of you have seen that. The show of Nima Al-Khorshid, who does dialogue works. He had a show with Scott Ritter. Have you seen that recently? Where Scott Ritter went really, really hard on him and said that Iran should, I don't know what he said, but something in the likes of Iran should stop fighting back because they will be nuked to oblivion.
They will commit suicide, actually.
Yeah, and Nima was very calm and very, very respectable, and he said that, sorry, I just disagree with you. I don't think that is the case. And then Scott Ritter said, the Russians would never stand for this. The Russians would never stand for this. And then I was like, do you really think that the Iranians need to listen to Daddy Russia and Daddy America? What's going on here? I'm very confused. What is this? What is this kind of thinking? You know what I mean? Well, where's this coming from? Vanessa?
Actually, there was absolute fury from regional voices against Scott Ritter after that interview. You probably didn't see it, but on X, a number of very respected academic and journalist voices here, particularly in Lebanon, which of course is under constant bombardment from Israel, basically went crazy. I mean, I don't think they had any great love for Ritter anyway, but the backlash from his attitude towards Iran and his consistently Orientalist attitude towards the region, to be fair. I mean, someone sent me another video in which he said that he spits on all the Syrians who allowed Jolani to enter the country. And I'm sorry, but even Syrians are not saying that. Do you know what I mean? When your country has destroyed Syria for 75 years on and off through various CIA, MI6 allied operations, of course, in conjunction with Israel, and then your country and particularly Trump, who Ritter was supporting in the beginning for election and saying that he was going to end all wars, and simply not brooking any argument to that effect. Of course, we all knew what was going to happen as soon as Trump became president, and even prior to his inauguration, it began happening. And so, the region is starting to get fed up with this white male supremacist, because he will still defend the US Marines despite the atrocities that they've committed globally, and particularly here in this region, right? And I don't want this to become a criticism of Ritter, but I'm just trying to transmit the reaction from here in this region, which I think is very important. They've had enough. They've had enough of Westerners basically lecturing them about how they should react to Western hegemony and aggression and genocide, because Israel is an extension of that genocidal colonialist policy and strategy that has destroyed this region for well over a century, right? So that's number one. I think coming back to the question of who benefits from this war with minimal input, it is China and Russia. Russia, you mentioned the increase in oil prices. Now, I've looked at the timeline of the UN Security Council resolution being abstained on by both Russia and China again, after they had previously abstained on the Gaza-Trump peace plan that has effectively just continued rolling out the final solution for the Zionists in Gaza and in the West Bank. The eradication of Palestinian presence and identity in their own country, in Palestine. Around the end of February, Russia was facing a really drastic hemorrhaging of funds from their national wealth fund, their fiscal revenue fund, and so on. It was really reaching emergency levels. Then after the war against Iran was started by Israel and the US, and Imam Khamenei was assassinated, on the 3rd of March, Putin had conversations with all the leaders of the Gulf countries that basically have US bases on their territory that are being used to massacre Iranian civilians on a daily basis. Right, so he spoke to all of them, from UAE to Bahrain, etc. Then he had a conversation with Trump, and that was reported in Russian media as being a very constructive conversation. Almost immediately before the abstention on the Security Council resolution that was also co-sponsored by India, another BRICS member, but it was tabled by Bahrain, that is now currently cracking down viciously on any dissidents that are supporting Iran against the US and Israel. Then basically Russia abstained. They did propose their own draft, but again, that was just a kind of a unilateral ceasefire. It didn't name the aggressor, right? And that UN Security Council resolution was criminal in my view, because what did it do? It demonized Iran for defending itself against a criminal aggression, which is appalling. If that is your ally, do you do that? Do you basically defend Israel and reduce its role in the aggression against Iran while amplifying Iran's right to defend itself as some kind of aggression against the Gulf states that you've just been speaking to and that you have very deep trade relationships with, right, including Israel? And then suddenly, at the same time as they abstained, Kirill Dmitriev arrived in the US and was negotiating with Jared Kushner and Stephen Witkoff, suddenly, who are both, of course, arch-Zionists. And then suddenly the sanctions are lifted for a period of 1 month on Russian oil. The tariffs on India to buy Russian oil are suddenly miraculously lifted also. And suddenly Russia is looking at $150 million per day of additional revenue, which is probably now increasing, right? That's the Russian perspective. Then from the Chinese perspective and the Russian perspective, the longer that the war against Iran continues, the greater the chance that the US is going to deplete its own armament stocks, including its interceptor missiles, but virtually across the board. This has always been the danger. That's why the Pentagon warned Trump to back off on the aggression against Yemen, because, as they said very publicly, if you continue, we're going to deplete our stocks that we need for China. So the longer that the war continues against Iran, Russia benefits in Ukraine, and China benefits from the perspective of any potential of a war against China over Taiwan, for example. So they're both happy to actually sit back and let the US exhaust its stocks and be unable to replete them, because, of course, Iran is also refusing any kind of ceasefire negotiations at all, because it knows that they're never going to be honored. It's just like any humanitarian ceasefire. It's only going to be for the US and Israel to replete their stocks and to be able to start the war again. Right. So I think on all those levels, Russia and China stand to benefit. I think from the Russian perspective, on social media and in a lot of media outlets, including those voices that we've been talking about, it is very much being exaggerated what Russia is doing to militarily help Iran. And that has been demonstrated by analysts like Ehsan Safanajad, who's spoken regularly. People can go to his channel and he breaks down exactly what Russia has supplied and hasn't supplied, right? And to a degree, the same with China. They haven't supplied, for example, according to Ehsan, they haven't supplied hypersonic missiles. They are supplying the Beidou military satellite system, which enables Iran to detect targets. It jams the US and Israeli interference systems and so on. And it works and operates much better in Iranian territory, particularly because it's so mountainous, than the GLONASS Russian systems. And as Fi said, Sergei Lavrov and Dmitry Peskov have both denied either sending drone tech or offering surveillance to help Iran target US and Israeli assets. And I always have to come back to this point, which is related to Syria and the competition, let's say, between Russia and Iran inside Syria. And we can talk a lot more about this. I've been documenting this now for about 3 years. But Moscow actually intervened in Syria, and this is well documented, not only to fight against ISIS, but also to protect Israel's national security. As I said, this is well documented. In 2013, Lavrov had a meeting with Yossi Cohen about the potential of intervention in Syria. In 2018, Putin spoke with Trump, who said at the end of it, it was a good conclusion for Israel. Jolani, when the al-Qaeda forces were enabled, partially by Russia, to take over Damascus, he actually said, we ran this operation now to prevent a larger resistance war against Israel. And he also said the Russian buildup in the south of Syria for some time, since around 2018, Russia basically built a security buffer zone on the border with the occupied Golan territories to prevent the expansion of Iranian or Lebanese resistance factions to the border with the Golan. And this was always a criticism of President Assad. And I've always said, but how they can't extend, because Russia is effectively providing protection for Israel in this region, in the south of Syria. And we know, for example, Russia would stand down as part of the deconfliction agreement between Israel and Russia before they intervened in Syria, to basically allow Israel to bomb Iranian forces, Iranian personnel, even in the embassy in Damascus in 2024, and also the supply lines from Iran through Iraq, through Syria, into Lebanon and Palestine. So there's a multitude of other points to make on that. But I come back to this point again. When a country like Russia is so clearly allied and cooperating with Israel, and it has such a huge Zionist Shabbat Lubavitch presence in its country that has influence within the political and economic circles to a huge extent, they are not going to, let's say, defend Iran against Israel. They will take a backseat in the same way China is to a degree. But China has kind of never really made any huge pretense of being a massive ally of Iran. It's always been, it's always been much more realistic in its statements and in its partnerships. Russia needed Iran to supply the drones for use in Ukraine. And I remember when the special military operation began, and there was still Russian military on the ground inside Syria. And I remember sitting down and having a discussion with a number of high-level military and intelligence, actually, from Russia in Damascus. And they told me, Vanessa, we don't have the drones for this war because the corruption is so great in Russia that the military officers in charge of the production have been giving these numbers to Putin for years. So he's assuming he's got all these, stock holding of drones, and they're not there. That's coming directly from Russian military and very high-level Russian military that were concerned about what was happening, that Putin was entering this war against Ukraine on the basis of false information. And so from that perspective, actually, Iran stepped in and saved Russia, in my opinion, because we always hear the opposite. And I love how you said on our interview with our conversation with Dmitry Lascaris, is the US going to make Iran a superpower? But like some people argued in the comments, I would argue Iran had already developed the capability to be a superpower and to take on what are two nuclear states with the most experienced and biggest armies in the world today. I mean, not Israel, but certainly the US, right? And this is where I get fed up, because how social media is always pushing this narrative that without Russia and China, Iran wouldn't be able to do anything that it's doing now. It's not true. I saw a post yesterday, I sent it to Fee, where he's Syrian Russian, and he's working actually within one of the kind of Wagner type militia forces inside Russia. And he said the Shahed drone, the advanced Shahed drone, is causing massive damage in Ukraine. And he posted a video. No one will amplify that. No one will actually praise Iran for actually coming to the rescue of Russia in Ukraine, right? It was Iran that backed off on the mutual defense pact, by the way, because Russia was trying to pressure them to actually send forces to fight on their behalf in Ukraine. So it was Iran that backed off on that, not Russia. So I think this is where the nuance just gets destroyed, and where the agency of a country like Iran that is genuinely taking on the entire Epstein cult right now, and it's fighting alone.
Yeah.
And it's losing Iranian people, children, civilians, hospitals, infrastructure, water plants, oil facilities alone.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I there are different opinions, I must say. So if I have to be honest here, I also talked to a guy I have great respect for, Ali Alizadeh, And according to him, an analyst also from Iran, and
Yeah,
according
I
to
know
him,
him.
he's pretty convinced that the Chinese play a big role in the background. And I also must have, I think we do have to admit that the Baidu system is a game changer. And I think the
Absolutely.
United States would like nothing more than the Chinese to cut that off, because this is helping them too much. So it is a kind of, you could say, it is a kind of very powerful and open support, you could say, from the Chinese. And some people would come with the argument about the UN abstention, and I'm gonna be a bit play the devil's advocate here a bit, so to speak. Who would say, for example, Peter has that opinion, and he says that we have all seen that the UN is pretty much useless now. It's an imperial system. It has no impact. So why would you waste your veto or vote and risk a diplomatic spat for something that is useless anyway, when you can in the background support Iran, for example? So that is an argument I often hear. So that is one thing. Maybe you can answer that, Fiorella. And I also want to ask. I just want to get back to that Putin's seeming love for Israel. What's the root of this? What's going on here? My question is, Fiorella, in Russia, the feeling you get, is it 50-50? Is the majority maybe against Israel? What is the sentiment among the people compared to Putin? And where does that kind of love come from? And how would you respond to that thing about the UN, that it's UN is useless anyway, so why would you risk a diplomatic spat? Okay, a lot, but you have the floor.
I definitely want to hear Vanessa's answer to the UN. Mine is, if it's,
Absolutely.
if it's so useless and unimportant, then why not do the basic minimum and vocally address something? Because if the UN is useless, then why is it always addressed by Russia and China and BRICS? The BRICS uh, the block is mirrored by the UN Charter. Every single time that BRICS is brought up, it is actually mentioned that it's going to align with the UN Charter. So they obviously put a lot of importance into the legal and humanistic and international aspects of the UN. It is not necessarily us. I agree. The UN is useless. It's toothless. It has done absolutely nothing to stop the genocide of Palestinian people, the ongoing now attempt to Nakba southern Lebanon, and it has done nothing to stop what Israel and the United States are doing to civilians in the region and Iran now. It's done nothing. But if it's done nothing, then what is its purpose then? If it's just going to continue to do nothing, we have seen former UN representatives leave their post because they're saying out loud what everybody knows to be true, that the UN is basically an extension of the Zionist Western US cabal. It's being pretty much handled for their own benefit. So then what is the purpose of the UN if it's not going to be an actual legal representation of international law? Then what's the point? So I think I let's flip it around. At the very least, you should risk something that is morally and legally wrong. What Israel and the United States did to Iran while negotiations were supposed to be happening is illegal. A lot of the weapons that have been used are illegal. A lot of things that have happened are illegal. So if you're going to back a resolution effectively that is criminalizing Iran for its legal right to defend itself, then I don't understand how anybody could justify that via some sort of just, mental gymnastics, is what I see it as, to justify Iran or Russia's and China's lack of moral stance. I mean, to me, it's a very simple matter. This is not just one occasion, as Vanessa mentioned. This is now an ongoing thing, and if it doesn't matter, then it doesn't matter. So do it. So do the right thing. So that's the one thing. Um, the other thing, as I mentioned, the Russian population as a whole. You can go to any Russian channel on Telegram, any Russian forum, VK, or any of those, and you can look at how the general population online is discussing Iran and Israel, and you will see an overwhelming support for Iran from the Russian population. They look at Israel as being the oppressor, as being the ones that instigated this war, and that is the overall sentiment I've gotten, especially from locals who are not even, some of them aren't even political, but it is a stance that is taken just based on looking at the reality of the on the ground, because at the very least in Russia you do see more of a less biased perspective when it comes to how Israel is spoken about openly. It's not like you have APAC openly like praising Netanyahu and Israel every 5 seconds in the United States. However, as Vanessa mentioned, the Chabad Lubavitch and the very Zionist aspects, especially in the banking sector, and also just in general in the upper class, you have the Zionist influence. You have that in the media as well, where Russia always has several, especially Russian media in particular. They have the Russians in Israel, in Tel Aviv, the reporters showing the Israeli side. There's always this idea of not making Israel angry, making sure that Israel is really informed about what's happening in Russia. They also get a lot of their information from Russia. Now, they obviously also have the
So
Gulf.
if I'm sorry for jumping in, Fiorella, but there's something on my mind. I'm really curious about that. So is Putin, by a segment of Russia, is Putin seen as a bit of a softie? Then
Yeah.
he's a bit of a softie to the West and to Israel.
Oh, 100%. That's been the latest discussion, is like Putin is being looked on, especially I think from the defense side, the military side, as not going hard enough against the United States, and also questioning his relationship with Israel. People, there's a lot of conversations about Putin having Zionist friends, which I think John Helmer has talked about. There's conversations about his upbringing and all of the closeness he's had with Zionists. But apart from that, it is the response to the United States and Israel, or the lack of response. Because as Vanessa mentioned, yeah, Russia is benefiting, right, from this war. But the reality is that's not what it looks like to the majority of people. They're wondering why they're backing off. And we know it's because, well, I think 100% think it is because Kirill Dmitriev is seeking a negotiation for Ukraine, but specifically the negotiations rally around economic aspects. We're talking about minerals, we're talking about all of these issues related to the Arctic and the Donbass. That is what Russia is hyper focused on. And when you mentioned the lack of having military the military drones, when that was mentioned, there was this idea that Russia has, endless supply of military arms, endless supply of army and soldiers and all of that. That's just not true. The numbers are inflated as to what Russia can do, and constantly in media, this is inflated. Like, I mean, if you talk to an average Russian, they're going to tell you we don't have as many weapons or as big of a military or all of these things that everybody says we do. So the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, right? What you're getting from a lot of these, so-called pro Russia analysis is a very whitewashed version of Russia as this sort of ooh, like Putin is so like strong and he's just gonna join Iran and China's gonna join and they're all gonna fight in this superhero movie and they're gonna defeat the US and Israel. That's just never gonna happen. That's just not how Russia operates. It's also not what they're doing. You can see it as to how they've been doing this even before Syria, but Syria, Venezuela, Cuba, all of these indicators. I mean, even the oil to Cuba has been meticulously planned and discussed. This is something that I just want to throw in there. That was discussed with Kirill Dmitriev and with the negotiators when they met about Russia Ukraine. The oil for Cuba, that was discussed. That was not like Putin is going to defy the United States and just break through the siege and send oil. That's not how they do things. They don't do things based on altruistic idealism. They are not the Soviet Union. And even then, people just put these ideas of Russia being a certain way that it isn't. And the thing is, I always have to differentiate between the Russian government, the Russian Federation, and the people. And I will say, just to answer your question, yeah, there's definitely a rising anti-Israeli sentiment, and I think there has been, but it's becoming more apparent, and it's becoming more vocal. I would say people are questioning Putin's decisions. There's less trust in the party right now. Is the most unpopular. He's no longer part of that party. He left it and he ran as an independent the latest time, but there is literally the lowest number of support for his former party, which is still effectively like where he gets most of his support from, than there ever has been. So anybody's telling you that, you know, Putin is the most number one beloved right now would not be, in my opinion, having an accurate perspective on this.
Vanessa, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the UN Security Council aspect, I kind of, this frustrates me, this argument, because if you're going to say the UN Security Council is defunct, so why is anyone bothering it? Yeah, right. Why is anyone bothering it? Because there's no alternative. Nobody has built an alternative. No one. Like, have BRICS built an alternative where they can hold sessions and decide on what it... No. So it's the only mechanism within which all of these countries can operate as a collective. And actually, yes, they can do something. Had Russia and China vetoed both the Trump peace scam and the Bahraini tabled resolution, what would happen? It would continue. But the thing is that Russia and China would have taken a stand. And people underestimate the importance of that, not only for their image amongst anti-imperialists, that's less important, but for the people here in Lebanon, the people in Palestine, the people in Syria, the people in Iraq, the people in Yemen, the people in Iran who are literally dying on a daily basis in some of the most horrendous ways. You've talked about this, that Gaza is being handed over to the Epstein class. It's basically a community, the majority of whom are under the age of 18, is being handed over to child abusers and torturers, rapists, right? And they can't even put their hand up at the UN. I don't care if the UN is useless. There's nothing else. There's nothing else that gives that visible moral signal to the world that we object to what is going on. And I have not seen that. And the people here deserve it. Even if you're not prepared to go a step further and provide physical aid, help, you're not going to stop dealing with Israel. At least respect their sacrifice for a better world, because that's effectively is what they're doing. So no, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I just don't accept that at all, because if that's the case, then ignore everything that the UN does.
Yeah, there seems to be no moral leadership in this world, except for, I would say, currently Iran, as a powerful state, you could say. And it's very peculiar. We're really living in a day and age that nobody is really standing up and to be the moral voice of the world, like I said, except Iran. But besides that, nobody, like none of the powerful countries, nowhere. It's baffling that nobody takes that opportunity, for example, to stand at the UN and to be really, really that moral voice that the world really needs. And there seems to be just no world leader currently that has it in them to take that role. It's very peculiar how this world currently is so feckless. It's unbelievable to me. And people will, like you said, people will say, "Oh, that's the UN. It's useless. This and that." No, I think you make a very good point, Vanessa. People, especially in West Asia, but all over the world, are longing for this. Like, we need humanity. We need some moral voice to make us feel we're still living among human beings here. We're not living in a world of demons and hell. You know what I mean?
And I think that story that Dimitri told of when he was in Iran and he went into the hospital to meet a girl who'd been a victim of one of the bombing raids. And it moved him to such an extent he didn't realize he was being filmed, but he started crying. And that was broadcast across all of the Iranian TV stations. And like he said, the reaction he received, because finally they're seeing someone from the West having empathy with their situation. People don't see that here. They get people like Scott Ritter yelling at them about what they should do. That's it. But there's no respect for the culture, for the sacrifice they've made, for the war that they are fighting alone. From a moral perspective, they're very much alone. Even here in Lebanon, it's the same moral perspective as you get in Iran, in Yemen, in Iraq amongst the resistance factions, formerly in Syria, although Syria was different in the sense that it's a state and a very kind of secular state. But that's another actual point that I wanted to make. You mentioned in our last conversation how the Soviet Union backed Saddam Hussein in the war against Iran. In fact, they supplied more weapons than the West in total. They backed off at a certain point.
That must have been someone else.
Oh, well, it was brought up in the conversation. Oh, okay.
Okay.
But the main reason for that, so that's from the Soviet Union. Also, the reason why the Soviet Union backed the creation of the State of Israel. The reason they backed the creation of the State of Israel is that they, in my opinion, it wasn't the cleverest plan on their part, having seen that it was Britain and the Rothschilds that were creating Israel, to think that they could use it as a communist, left-leaning enclave in the Middle East to expand Soviet power. They backed Saddam Hussein against Iran. They did back off at a certain point, and then they came back in and provided even more equipment. I mean, I think it came to about $9.2 billion worth of support of Saddam Hussein. But the greatest fear was the Islamic Revolution. The fact that Islamic Revolution could spread to Afghanistan and Soviet Central Asia. And if you remember, when we go to the Bush-Putin conversations, I think we have talked about this before, where Putin was saying it's not a war against terror, it's a war between Jewish capital and Muslim capital. And at that point, he was also helping Bush, if you like, or agreeing with Bush that Iran shouldn't have nuclear weapons, etc. Right?
He was the first who contacted Bush. Putin was the first who contacted Bush, giving him support, offering support to fight in West Asia, to fight so-called terrorism.
Yeah. And in Syria, from my experience, in 2018, for example, Russia was actually lobbying President Assad to get Iran out of Syria. Russia didn't want Iran in Syria. They didn't perceive them as an ally. They perceived them to some degree as a partner. But as I keep saying, they allowed Israel, they stood down and allowed Israel to target their positions and the arms supplies that were coming in across the land routes, right? So, and this is my opinion, Russia inherently has a fear of the Islamic Revolution, of the spread of the Islamic Revolution in this region, because it's inherently opposed to global capitalism. And so it inherently allies itself with Israel and with what are perceived as the moderate Sunni states, just as the CIA wanted to replace President Assad with Sunni business class in Syria because they are perceived as easier to deal with and more likely to enter into debt slavery and financial independence, etc., etc. This is something I've just been thinking about for the last few days, because it becomes very clear, and I'd like to get actually Fiorella's opinion as to, because I know people are going to say, oh, but, you know, in Russia, there's 15% Muslim population. But the
but they're not
policy
running
in
the
Russia,
show.
no, and the policy in Russia is inherently perceived as Christian conservative values. And that's very much what they relied upon in Syria, actually, to get a really strong foothold in certain regions in Syria, was this Christian narrative, particularly Orthodox Christian narrative. So I think that takes it almost into another dimension, but it's something that I think is very important for people to understand, because what Iran represents is actually the inverse of global capitalism. It's usury-free banking, it's free healthcare, independent banking, nationalization of all of their resources, for example, free education, the empowerment of women, etc., etc., etc. It's the absolute anathema to what the West and Israel, the Gulf states, and I think Russia are actually working towards.
And it's the same as when people say, "Oh, but Israel has a lot of black and brown Arab Jews and etc. etc." And then I'm like, "Yeah, but they're not running the show. The elite political class are all white Ashkenazi Jews." And it's the same in Russia. You can say they're 50% Muslims. Yeah, but who's running the show? All white Russians. So there is this also in Russia. There is still this European white Christianity kind of white supremacy aspect that we are never allowed to discuss. But that's I'm definitely sure that is going on as well. Otherwise, the ruling class would not mostly be white Russians, you know. And I think there is also that kind of fear, and that's why I think, as not a specialist like you guys, and especially you who live there, Fiorella, but I think that there is still that also that longing to be part of white empire among Putin. You know, that kind of idea that he is a European and that kind of wish to be part of that Western kind of bloc. What do you think?
I would say that is regional, definitely from Putin, definitely from Moscow overall, overwhelmingly. You know, capitals tend to be that way, to be more westernized in pretty much every country, but it's specifically true in Russia because of just proximity as well. St. Petersburg, even more so. St. Petersburg pretty much mirrors any European city you've been to. And Moscow is extremely now is attempting to bring back the Orthodox Christianity reminiscent of not the Soviet Union, but reminiscent of the Tsar and the Russian Empire. And that is true. There is like a push to go towards that more conservative, ultra religious, ultra, just a traditional thing. They've been talking about traditional values, and there's this is the perspective from the
And
Kremlin.
racialized, Fiorella, racialized, is that also something that you
Yes.
see, like the whiteness aspect of the Europeans?
Well, if you look at Kirill Dmitriev, for example, he aligns himself with a lot of the ultra white nationalists in all over the
Mhm.
UK and in Australia, and he has this perspective that I've seen be quite vocal online against immigrants and against that European worry of the immigrant issue happening in Europe, which is obviously a concern in terms of the population aspect, in terms of all of that, but they never talk about the nuances as to why the immigrants are coming in, the various types of immigrants coming in. It becomes a very anti-immigrant prejudice type of position, and that is being largely supported by people like Kirill Dmitriev and people who are very much talking about the control of immigration. Now in Russia, you have a lot of Muslims, as you mentioned, and they have a lot of people are allowed to worship however they please. Um, the idea of having the Muslim religion or of having Islam around is a normal idea among the population. But as you mentioned, they are not the ones in power. And further, the immigration issue. When you talk about Russia, the Russian Federation, it is massive. When most people think about Russia, they think about Moscow. The further east you get, more towards what used to be parts of the Soviet Union, the Central Asian aspects, you have um, basically a huge population of Muslim people. Then you have the relationship with Tajikistan and Uzbekistan that also has a lot of the Muslim populations that have been used and weaponized by Ukraine for being the ones that set up these terrorist attacks in Russia. And so that's created this idea that pretty much gives them the onus to look at these populations as being the ones that are the problematic ones. So if you're out on the street, let's say in Moscow, and you look like you're Uzbeki or you're Tajik, there is kind of this more of like a sentiment of, oh, like, let's stop them. The officials will stop them and ask them for their papers, ask them for their their the paperwork that they have. They're pretty much these second class citizens. They're doing the snow plowing, they're doing the working lower labor type of jobs that regular Russians from Russia, born in Russia, are not doing. Now, there are different aspects to that. I'm not saying that everybody is racist or anything like that. I think mostly what you see in the United States doesn't happen in Russia. But I will say there is a sentiment of just kind of uncertainty as related to this idea that Putin, as Vanessa mentioned, has always talked about, opposing terrorism, opposing fighting terrorism. And he says this in a lot of his speeches. If you listen to his speeches, we always stand against terrorism, terrorism, terrorism. So this idea of Muslims being terrorists is still there, but it's not, discussed openly in the way that I think it should be discussed. And it's coming more so from the state, and that sort of, oh, these people are coming in now and they're given all these opportunities because Russia needs the labor. Russia needs more people in Russia. This is why they've been incentivizing people to go, because there's so much land and not enough people. They also need to decentralize their economy from Moscow and move it into the central part of Russia and the Far East, which is why you have the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, the Eastern Economic Forum. It's that push to get people into these unpopulated areas of Russia. But this idea that Russia is this perfect coexisting uh, area is just not true. And the push that we're seeing, for example, to go back to traditional values, to go back to Orthodox Christianity, is it's the government perspective. When you look at the younger populations, they're not religious. They're not, they tend to be more liberal, And so Russia's in a dangerous position right now. And this is something that I don't think is discussed. You have a growing um, sentiment of just from the youth of not relating to either the nostalgia felt by the older and increasingly less populated aspects of the Soviet Union, where things were better from their perspective under in the Soviet Union. People had healthcare, they had education fully, they had the job workforce, they were paid more, and all of this stuff. So you have that perspective. And then you have the youth that's looking at the special military operation, that's looking at what's going on, especially the ones in Moscow feel more European. And they kind of are like, why aren't we done with this war right now? And then you have the rest of Russia, which is completely different priorities in Moscow. They're less, capitalist or more focused on getting a stable economy. They feel completely different in terms of that aspect. And there is this push of, yes, we're all Russians, but there's different ethnicities and different desires and needs. And Russia is in danger because they're so varied, that this is the opportunity that the West will continuously use to balkanize them, which is why you don't make any sort of deal with the United States. But as you mentioned, Putin always wanted to be a part of Europe, right? And in spite of all the attacks against Europe, it's almost like there's an attempt to replace Europe with Russia. And that's what it seems to be. Make Russia the new European superpower. Uh, and that's a whole other, I think, discussion.
And that also explains, I would say, a lot of these more conservative types in among Western independent media commentators. Their love for Russia. There is this undercurrent of there are also these conservative white Christian society, or at least that's in their perception. I mean, Russia is very big. And there, like I said, there is this kind of undercurrent of maybe even unwitting racism, where people have that affinity with Russia and project that kind of heroism on white Christian Russia, while at the same time diminishing the immense contribution of Iran and how Iran is actually really showing some moral leadership besides its very strong stance against the U.S. empire. And I think that is something that we really, we should really consider that and respect that and think about what's going on here. I think it's earth shattering. How can you say that? Like what the Iranians are doing is also in a way very shattering to that racial myth that is inside people's psychology, those mental schemas that we have about which populations decide the fate of the world, which populations do not decide the fate of the world, and even if they seem to change the course of history, well, then it must be allowed by Russia, for example. You know what I mean? So I think there is some there are some mental shifts coming, I think, in the way we perceive human beings around the world, and I think we have to thank Iran for that. Of course, also the Arab resistance in the region. Don't get me wrong, but what Iran is doing right now, of course, is extremely impactful, and I think there is a sense of, among a lot of these commentators, a sense of almost, I would say, an unconscious inability to accept what is going on here, to accept that kind of strength of a country like Iran. I see you want to comment, Vanessa.
Well, I think also to somehow maybe justify that also is that the Zionists have since, they were established in Palestine in 1948, but even before, as we talked about before, they've been eradicating the history. I mean, under Trump's first administration, Netanyahu shut down the Nakba Museum, right? So basically sanctioning anyone from looking at the documents and the photographs and so on. And there has been an entire campaign to demonize Muslims as a collective group by the entire kind of Zionist cartel of media, Hollywood. We talked about this, video games and so on. Any kind of media complex is being used to effectively lump all Muslims together, number one. They're all terrorists. They're all extremists, fanatics, and so on. And that has effectively been the dominant narrative since 9/11. So I kind of do understand that for an ordinary person, it's very difficult to break out of that paradigm and actually look at a country like Iran, where, again, the propaganda narratives have been overwhelming, and actually look at it as a moral beacon in the world today, as a system of governance, as a philosophy, as an ideology. But if anyone looks deeper into Shia Islam, you will see that at its core ideology is the protection of the oppressed as number one. Not expansion, not economic gain, not global capitalist benefits from the world, but the actual protection and defense of the oppressed, wherever they are in the world. Right? It's very important, because that moral center, in my opinion, doesn't exist anywhere outside the resistance axis. And by that, I also include countries not within the Islamic sphere, let's say, even like Venezuela, Cuba, and so on, countries in Africa now that are coming to the fore, like Burkina Faso, who are genuinely working towards governance that benefits the people, the population, rather than the ruling elite or the oligarchies. And so I think it's going to take a lot of time for people to overcome that grating, as you describe it, and get into the understanding of what these resistance countries, these free countries, actually represent, which is this kind of moral leadership that we're all looking for. I'm not saying they're not flawed. I'm not saying but ultimately what is driving them is a moral cause, right? They've had enough. Like, Iran has been targeted. They know that ultimately they are to be destroyed for Israel and the US to survive as the supremacist, elitist, racist entity that it is, Epstein entity that it is. So, this is actually a war that is being fought by Iran and the resistance axis here in this region, as I've said before, to prevent the world just becoming really an Epstein ruling class with very little challenge or conflict against that. Because ultimately, if that happens, I think China will find a way to work around the issues and to build its economic dominance in certain areas. Will be driven into the kind of spheres of influence, the technate, right, vision, in my opinion. And so I don't really blame people for having that. I do kind of criticize people when, as you say, they are so invested in this image of Russia as some kind of particularly Orthodox Christian traditional values, doesn't entertain terrorism of any sort, but they're happy to invite the head of Al-Qaeda, formerly ISIS, to the Kremlin, not once, twice, right? So I just think, again, actually, you've hit on something which I think, because a lot of the commentators that are, let's say, pushing back against the incoming tech surveillance and kind of part of the all governments are in on it, are very often also holding Christian values. And I wonder if that puts a barrier between them understanding that not all governments are necessarily in on it. Right. That's just a thought I'm throwing out there. with people. But I've been watching a lot of these very good analysts, very good commentators, historically brilliant. Like their grasp of history and so on is fantastic, and I love watching them. But when it comes down to them having a blind spot as far as the Islamic Revolution and the Iranian constitution, the concept of Iranian governance, it's very clear to me. It's very sort of obvious.
Yeah, we've been heavily conditioned, of course, as Westerners against the Muslim world and Muslims and people from West Asia, whether from Iran or the Arab world. It has been a decades-long systematic psychological bombardment of racism towards people from West Asia, from Hollywood to our news programs to books to it's absolutely insane what the kind of garbage that our brains had to deal with when it comes to these people, and we are now undoing it slowly. And there's, in my opinion, one generation is already lost, and that's the boomers, and also not everyone. There, I mean, my parents were very anti-racist, so in that sense, it's not always the case, but. What I'm saying in general, you have that kind of generation. You see them in the news programs. You still see them in the how do you say that, these intellectual conversation programs, like in my country, the Netherlands. And it's like you hear the shit they say about Muslims and Arabs, and I'm just thinking, forget it. These people's brains are so... The racism is so deeply nested in those brains, you can't change it anymore. It's literally physical. You can't change those brains anymore. But you do see a change in the new generation that are very pro-Palestine often. They're supportive of Iran. Their brains have been shaped in a different way. So I do see change. But my goodness, have we been... I come from the 80s. And I grew up with movies, Rambo was always shooting Arabs dead. That was so normal in those days. Like every bad guy was an Arab, and they just shot them, and they were, and I'm like, the crap we had to deal with, and now it has. Now you see how beneficial that has been to global imperialism, and I think that what we're seeing right now is a breakage also of that kind of psychological chokehold that the United States and the West had on our sentiments towards West Asia. And I think Iran and the resistance in general are doing a very good job of really deconstructing that crap that the West has done to us. I think that's an evil that has been done to our brains. We didn't choose this. Yeah.
Definitely.
Any final comments, Fiorella, Vanessa?
No. Well, I'll just say that I think, it's funny. A lot of the people looking for this revolutionary idea, this sort of socialist, revolutionary, heroic reality, it exists in Iran. They just don't really see it for what it is. If anybody is that idea that they have, it is Iran. It is a resistance in general. The resistance, what it represents, it's a collective approach. It is an approach that looks on at humanity as equal, that is looking towards something better, something that is actually more rooted in an ideal that is altruistic and moral beyond the material pragmatism that exists in this world today. And so if you understand that that is what Iran and the resistance are doing, then it is that ideal that a lot of these people seek, when they look at films, for example, that have painted this revolutionary spirit as the heroes, which is ironic, especially coming from the United States and the West. Example, Star Wars. Example, any story where you have the underdog fighting the empire or fighting the evil. It's very easy for them to recognize it in a movie. But when it's happening in the reality of this world, when it's
And because
happening
they're
right
white,
now,
eh?
Yeah, well, yeah,
I was
that
just
too.
going to say.
That too. They can't see it before them. These are the people you should be rooting for. This is the right side. And in a side like this, in a situation like this, there is a good and a bad. There is like the right thing to do. There isn't just like, oh, well, we need to show both sides. It's like, yeah, but what's morally just and what isn't, and what's happening against Iran and the resistance and the people of West Asia is just morally corrupt. It is inhumane. It is so wrong. It is so easy to see that if it was laid out in a fictional Hollywood made movie. But just pretend it is for a minute of this movie, if that helps these people. The reality is these are people's lives, and these are very real things happening right now, and we have to understand that this is a turning point, I think, for humanity. We've kind of hit a lot of these points, and it's very clear that Iran is fighting evil, and I think we've all said it, all three of us, at one point or another, that Iran is fighting the evil on behalf, I think, of humanity, and all of the things that people look for in heroes. Well, that's what's going on right now from Iran and the entire resistance that are risking their lives, and that's it. And that it's as simple as that. I think people need to understand that.
Yeah, and I just want to just very quickly add, because I know we always get accused of blackpilling people, but I think another important aspect of the resistance that people need to understand, and it was an example that was set to me again or reinforced to me yesterday, was that Israel in the south of Lebanon, just as it's done in Gaza, destroyed an entire town. It literally detonated an entire town. And there were people on X kind of saying, oh my God, it's eradicated, it's erased. And someone from the region actually responded. She said, please don't talk like this. We don't see it this way. We just see it. We can rebuild it better. And I think that was something that really kind of hit me. Although I know it, I've lived in this region for years now, on and off. I mean, working and living in Syria and now living here in Lebanon. This is the attitude. This is the long war we're fighting, and we're prepared to sacrifice everything for this in order to be able to rebuild in freedom and with agency and with recognition of our rights and so on. And so I think that's a very powerful, because in the West, we'd be horrified. It's like, I don't know, if half of London was suddenly just detonated, I don't know if people would recover from that. But here, they see it just literally as part of the process towards the victory against evil. And that's something that I find very uplifting, actually, and very kind of strengthening even for myself. Is that, of course, there's going to be huge loss. There has to be, because you're fighting against an empire. You're fighting against an empire that is degraded to a level of evil and inhumanity that they're unrecognizable as human beings. Right? Even the statements that they're putting out now on social media are getting smashed. I mean, they're just not getting away with any of the propaganda and distortion of truth that they used to get away with even 10 years ago. They're not getting away with it anymore. People are fed up.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree that those are very, very, how do you say it, optimistic words. We just rebuild it better. I mean, I love it. And to get back to that heroism that you said, Fiorella, just as I said right now, when I was born in the 80s and I grew up as a little kid seeing all these Rambo movies of shooting Arabs and that kind of stuff, and which was completely normal in those days. It's unbelievable. And the reverse is, of course, also true. We have not only been conditioned to see people from West Asia that way, we've also been conditioned to see heroism as Western white individuals. So even today, when people see what's happening in Iran or in West Asia in general with the resistance, people still cannot connect psychological to that kind of resistance against the bad guys, you could say, because that kind of heroism is in their psychology. They cannot apply that kind of heroism that you see in movies of resistance movies and Second World War movies. They cannot apply that to Arabs or to people in Persia, Iranians. You know, it's like there is this disconnect, that inability to identify with these people. And that's why I always say also in my classes, race and racism is so central to geopolitics. And I'm not talking about intentional racism, people who say like, oh, I hate blacks or something. I'm talking about the cultural, unwitting, unconscious racism that is socialized into us by our cultures, by our social context, that influences the way how we now deal with, for example, the Palestinian resistance, Iran, Russia, etc., etc. And it's just so amazing that all these people always, even in Europe, all these people that celebrated Ukrainian resistance, we're talking about Nazis, and they could still identify more with Ukrainians than with what the Palestinian resistance is doing, or Iran. And there's just such a, like I said, there is this deep psychological effect of racialization that we are often very unaware of. You know what I mean? And like I said, I do see a change, don't get me wrong. I see a lot of very, very positive developments also among Westerners. You see a lot of support for Iran. You see a lot of support for the resistance. But like I said, that's also very much a generational thing. It's the new generation that seems to be really breaking with that stuff much more than when you see, for example, the older generation, like, for example, my parents' generation and even my own generation, you know, who came from that 80s B movies, anti-Arab movie period. Yeah, I guess let's forget about my part for now and stick to Vanessa's last words about we just rebuild it better, so we can end on a more optimistic note like last time. You've been very generous with your time, both of you, Fiorella and Vanessa. Always great to talk to you. We'll probably soon do it again. And let's talk soon and keep up the good fight.
Thanks, Karim.
Thank you.
Thanks for always having us on.
Static crackles, voices rise. Truth breaks through their velvet lies. A screen of fire, a shield of steel. BettBeat media makes you feel. No borders, no change. No silence.